Good afternoon and good morning, everyone, depending on your time zone. And thank you so much for joining our policy webinar. I'm Hamza Meddeb, Research Fellow at Carnegie Middle East Center, where I have the pleasure to co-lead the Political Economy program. Today's webinar will be dedicated to discussing reconstruction prospects in the MENA region. As you know, in Syria, in Libya, and certainly now in Gaza, the prospects for post-conflict reconstruction are incredibly uncertain. And here is the challenge, actually. Across the region, traditional reconstruction models don't seem to apply, actually. Typically, we think of reconstruction as something that happens or follows political settlements that paves the way to rebuilding infrastructure and restoring a central authority. However, in many cases, um, political fragmentation, geopolitical turbulent times, and the absence of settlements force us to rethink this model, actually. So more than ever, reconstruction is deeply tied to politics, to geopolitics, uh, how conflicts and the prevailing, of course, geopolitical dynamics and the availability of resources will all play critical roles in shaping the future of these reconstruction processes, either in Gaza, in Libya, or in Syria. And this, of course, brings up some critical questions. What are the key challenges future reconstruction efforts, and what are the key challenges future reconstruction efforts will be facing in Gaza? What are the prerequisites for successful reconstruction in the three cases in Gaza, in Libya, and in Syria? What are the political, economic implications of the reconstruction without settlement model that we are currently seeing in Libya? And I would be really happy to have the views of Jalal on this. Finally, how do the competing interests of regional powers in these conflicts, whether Gaza, Libya, and Syria, shape reconstruction efforts? And is there any realistic chance that regional powers might align on common goals, actually, in the three cases? So these are really some of the few issues we will try to explore in this webinar. And to address these questions, I have the pleasure really to have with me Noor Arafa, Jalal Harshawi, and Joseph Daher. Noor Arafa is research fellow at Malcolm Kerr Carnegie Middle East Center, where she co-leads the political economy program. Noor is my partner in crime, actually, for over 2 years now. Jalal Harshawi is a political scientist specializing in North Africa with a particular focus on Libya. He's also an associate fellow at the Royal United Services Institute. And Joseph Daher is visiting professor at the University of Lausanne and the author of a book on Syria, Syria After the Uprisings, The Political Economy of State Resilience. Of course, if you would like to ask questions to our speakers, please add them to the comment section, and I will be happy to share them with the speakers at the end of the webinar. Let me begin with Gaza, since it's really the most recent and the most tense, actually, war and case actually today in the geopolitics of the MENA region. The war actually remains intense. As you know, the humanitarian, social, and economic losses have reached unprecedented levels of devastation. And I'd like really to ask Noor to start with you, Noor, actually. What are the challenges that will be facing any future reconstruction efforts in Gaza in the coming months and years?
Thank you so much, Hamza, for organizing this webinar. It's a pleasure to be discussing these issues with you, Joseph, and Jalal. So in terms of the challenges, I'll briefly mention 4 key challenges that are currently facing reconstruction efforts in Gaza. The first one has to do with the fact that the ongoing war on Gaza is unprecedented in the scale of destruction and civilian casualties. So far, according to official records, almost 44,000 Palestinians had been killed killed. This is more than double the casualties from the Nakba, or the catastrophe that took place in 1948. We're talking about tens of thousands that are under the rubble, and more than 20,000 children that are missing. And these figures are likely to be huge underestimates because they don't account for indirect deaths, for example, from disease or from hunger, or those who actually were killed or who died and whose families could not report their deaths to the Ministry of Health or to hospitals, and so they are not accounted. So we're talking actually about much larger casualty figures. And besides the civilian casualties, the extent of the destruction in Gaza has been immense and has not been seen since World War II. By November 2023, which is just 1 month after the war started, Israel had already dropped the equivalent of 2 nuclear bombs on Gaza. And the UN has estimated that clearing the rubble alone could take up to 15 years and cost between $500 and $600 million. And since Gaza's infrastructure has been systematically dismantled as part of Israel's plans to make Gaza unlivable, there has been a multifaceted crisis that has been created. A public health emergency has been triggered. We've been hearing about cases of polio, hepatitis, the destruction of agricultural land, and Israeli restrictions on aid delivery have also been leading to a major crisis of food security, pushing Gaza to the brink of famine. And the long-term implications of the war that any reconstruction strategy will have to deal with are also very dire. UNDP has projected that the war is likely to set back Gaza's education and economic indicators to the 1955 levels. So we're talking about almost 70 years of lost progress when it comes to health, education, and the economy. And this, we're talking about these, things without even mentioning the psychological trauma that has been inflicted by the war, which will have enduring effects on the populations for generations to come. So the path to reconstruction is a very daunting one, and that's one key challenge that I would like to highlight. A second one has to do with the nature of the current war. Conventional reconstruction models, they typically assume a clear end to hostilities before rebuilding can commence. But there's a question here: what if this war never ends? What if there's instead a shift between high intensity and lower intensity phases? Can we afford to wait for this war to clearly end before beginning the reconstruction process? If not, how can urgent needs be addressed? And how can rebuilding occur? Would this be a possibility if hostilities continue? So there are several questions here about the nature of reconstruction in an ongoing war zone. And the key question as well is, are international donors prepared to support reconstruction efforts in Gaza if it remains an ongoing war zone? So I think in the future, we might have to, or even now, actually not in the future, we will have to develop new models of humanitarian aid and development that can function within a context of ongoing instability. A third challenge I would like to highlight has to do with the uncertainty surrounding the governance structures after the war. The key question here is, within what institutional and political framework will reconstruction occur? We've heard different proposals for governing Gaza. Most of them, actually, the overwhelming majority of these proposals are about governing Gaza in isolation of the West Bank. We've heard proposals about governance by regional powers, by a multinational force, by the Palestinian Authority, local families, exiled politicians. However, the institutional landscape remains very uncertain, and unfortunately, Palestinian voices are usually excluded from these debates about a future governance structure in Gaza. And so this uncertainty leads to a very pressing concern, which is, what if Gaza lacks functional governance entirely? How would this affect reconstruction? So the lack of clarity in this area could significantly affect reconstruction efforts, potentially undermining their effectiveness and their ability to meet the urgent needs of the population. And then the fourth challenge, which is another key question, is who will pay for reconstruction? The UNDP has estimated that Gaza's reconstruction could cost $50 billion. We heard months ago Sisi saying that it could cost up to $90 billion. So the key question is, who will fund this enormous undertaking? In principle, Israel and the United States, which is complicit in this war, should be held accountable and should be paying reparations for the devastation of the Gaza Strip. But realistically, we know that other nations, specifically GCC countries, will be expected to bear the financial burden. Now, the problem is that with previous reconstruction efforts, especially after the 2014 war on Gaza, GCC countries failed to fulfill their pledges, and the international community has become increasingly skeptical. There's this donor fatigue about the impact of their investments, because we've been stuck in a cycle of war, reconstruction, then another war, then another phase of reconstruction. And so this is why it's very important for reconstruction efforts to go hand in hand with diplomatic pressure to reach a lasting political solution that would uphold Palestinian rights and that would ensure that the funds that will be distributed by donor countries will not go to waste in a future war launched on Gaza.
Thank you, Noor. I mean, thanks for bringing up three key issues. Actually, really, I found them extremely important. As you mentioned, the idea that the war might end, but this will not be equivalent to an end of the conflict, and we might end up into protracted conflict. Actually, the governance issue with the fragmentation, the political and security fragmentation, and the last point, your last point, actually, regarding the who will pay and the sources of revenues and the need for probably sort of settlements and regional settlement in a way. I mean, besides the material actually aspects, these are really will be three key important points, and it highlights actually both of the three of them highlights the difficulty of reconstruction today in the region, and specifically in the case of Gaza. Well, let me turn to discussing the Libyan case with Jalal. Actually, the Libyan case is quite interesting because simply what we saw over the previous maybe 1 year or 1 year and a half is sort of what we can describe maybe as a sort of reconstruction effort, but without really political resolution. There was a de-escalation in the Libyan conflict, but still the country is really fragmented. I mean, politically, from a security perspective, there is no agreement and no resolution, political resolution, no settlement actually found between the different Libyan factions and actors. And of course, besides the destruction of the civil war, Eastern Libya has been hit by deadly floods and the collapse of the dam of Derna last year in 2023. And following this episode, humanitarian disaster, authorities in Eastern Libya, led by Khalifa Haftar, announced a sort of reconstruction process, the creation of a development and reconstruction fund, endowed with more than $2 billion. But without explaining and without really, clarifying what are the objectives, the purposes, etc. of this the whole reconstruction process. So I'd like really to ask Jalal here on specifically on the case of Eastern Libya. What are the domestic and regional stakes actually behind this fund, this newly created fund, the Reconstruction and Development Fund created and announced by Eastern Libyan authorities?
Yeah, thank you very much, Hamza. It's an honor, and I'm very, very flattered by the invitation from you and Carnegie. Construction is a very important topic in Libya. It was already an important topic before the tragedy of Derna in September 2023. And I think the questions you ask, for example, where does this reconstruction fund, that actually is supposed to be nationwide. So it's initiated from the East through a quote unquote law that was actually decreed by the Speaker of the House of Representatives in February. So there was no real vote. There's no parliamentary vote. That's an interesting issue, because if a company faces the reconstruction fund of Balqasem Haftar, we're talking about one of the 6 sons of Field Marshal Khalifa Haftar. If, let's say, a South Korean or European firm decides to engage in a contract with that fund, and there's a problem, maybe the company doesn't get paid, it could sue an entity and then later discover that it doesn't exist legally. So that's an interesting case. The other thing also is that although the aspiration of that reconstruction fund of Balqasem Haftar is nationwide, it's not for Eastern and Southern Libya only, those territories that are controlled by the Haftar family. It really aspires to help, let's say, the western city of Zlitan. We saw the floods earlier this year in February. There was some mysterious floods because of some structural fragility. It was actually instrumentalized for political reasons. And the other thing also is that it's not the only reconstruction fund from the East. You have also the Jihaz, the apparatus, the national development apparatus of Saddam Haftar, the other active son of Field Marshal Haftar. And the two are not really coordinating. There's no clashes or anything like that, but it's not full harmony. And the mandate of this other fund that is actually increasingly active, we saw a very ambitious bridge being built in the city of Sirte in central Libya by an Egyptian company that's actually linked to Gaza. It's the company of Ibrahim Al-Arjani, who's known for charging $5,000 to Palestinians to get out. So you can imagine his friendliness towards anything related to corruption. And he's very active in Eastern Libya. We could talk about that. But I wanted to really start with an anecdote. As you might have heard, there was a major crisis that really almost caused the entire economy of Libya to grind to a halt. It's the Central Bank of Libya crisis that began in mid-August of this summer and ended in late September. And it hasn't really gotten resolved. But construction, the whole topic of construction played a role in precipitating the collapse of the preceding governor, Sadiq al-Kabir, who had been in that very strategic position for 13 years, really. And so there was a moment between the moment, when Prime Minister Dbeibeh and his allies decreed that he had to leave. They dismissed him, not really through legal channels, but they did, and they used their militias to intimidate him. But he didn't leave Tripoli right away. He left only on the 26th of August. So there was like almost a week where he met with militias, and the militias invoked as one reason they wanted to sympathize with the prime minister and push him out is because they had heard through the grapevine that actually the governor of the central bank had funded the reconstruction efforts in Eastern Libya. That was partly correct. In fact, the imbalance between Eastern Libya and Western Libya, the fact that the Haftar family has been making much more money, if you will, over the last couple of years than Tripoli, is not because of the central bank of Libya. It's because of other activities like narcotics and human smuggling and fuel smuggling, other activities. So here, the geographic advantage of the Houthi family really has made a difference. But it is true that construction is very much on everybody's mind in Libya, including the elites, which is ironic because the Dbeiba family has made its name through construction during the 90s and 2000s and the Gaddafi. So logically, the Dbeiba family should be winning that race. And we talked about sequence earlier. When does construction begin? So Hamza, you are absolutely correct. There's no political settlement. There are still two rival governments in Libya, one in Benghazi and one in Tripoli, but there hasn't been any war since June 2020. So that's really more than 4.5 years almost. And so it's not really reconstruction beginning before the end of the conflict. It's really after. And actually, both sides took their time. In 2021, the prime minister in Tripoli at the time had good relations with the governor and was able to fund, for example, a series of brand new electricity plants. We know that electricity shortages really are very, very important in the daily suffering of Libyans. So they built, thanks to that moment of calm, they built plants in Western Libya, even one in Tobruk. And then the politics that I was referring to kind of changed the picture. And during that time, the Haftar family was really not active. So the war in Benghazi itself had ended in December 2017. And in the middle of 2022, there was still nothing. I remember visiting Benghazi in late 2022. It was just the beginning. So the reconstruction actually had begun before the tragedy of Derna. So in terms of how to approach it from an infrastructure economics perspective, the Haftar family had a little bit of rehearsal. And then that's why they seized the opportunity to politicize the reconstruction of Derna and immediately expand their mandate. And you're right to say that they kind of earmarked $2 billion just for Derna, and they want much more for the rest. They have been active in southern cities like Barakashati and Marzouk and Sabha, and as I said, Ajdabiya, Sirte. So it's really a nationwide agenda. And so here, basically, they're trying to fake it until they make it. They want to intimidate their rivals by having this beautiful, positive image through the media. And I must say that in some regards, the efforts in Derna have exceeded a lot of expectations. I mean, a lot of things have been built, and they could have done nothing. Instead, they went to the other extreme. Now, in terms of the transparency, that's a second issue. I also wanted to say that almost zero of those billions of dollars that are being mobilized for reconstruction come from outside. This is Libyan wealth, really, for the vast majority. And what the Haftar family is doing is really ignoring the ministries of Tripoli. They built their own institutions, their own channels, and they want the central bank to fund their efforts without going through the audit bureau or the administrative authority, the control authority, or other watchdogs and ministries and mechanisms for oversight. So you could see that it's really has been a boon for the Haftar family, who's probably going to finish a lot of the work that was initiated. Then we're left with the question of the quality, the transparency, the percentage of the wealth that might have been, stolen in the process. This is something that will take several years to find out, but it has been played very cleverly by the Haftar family, who has been winning this contest. Thank you.
Thank you, Jalal. Quite fascinating case, really, Libya, actually, because it again. I mean, we are seeing a sort of politicization of reconstruction, as you said, and even, I mean, sort of tensions within the same bloc, not even between blocks, but within the same bloc, with all these uncoordinated, efforts and mechanisms. Let me move to Joseph and to discuss actually the case of Syria. Of course, I mean, Syria cannot rely on oil revenues, unlike Libya, for sure. But Assad actually has been relying on two wild cards. I mean, everyone following, the Assad and the regime, this resilience of the Assad regime in Syria has been actually following and closely the two wild cards mobilized by this regime. Meaning the Captagon and refugees. I remember last year, Joseph, the Minister of Foreign Affairs, announced something like, there will be no return of refugees without reconstruction. So tying really the idea of finding a solution to the refugee crisis with the reconstruction, of course, of Syria. And here my question actually is, to what extent reconstruction is a priority for the Assad regime and its neighbor, Turkey, Lebanon, but also Jordan for sure. So this is really an important question in my views, because simply it shows to what extent this regime, who has been always concerned by its survival, can prioritize or play with this card of reconstruction. So this is really, so to what extent really the Assad is really concerned by the reconstruction effort and process in the future. The floor is
Thank you, Hamza, and thank you, Carnegie, for inviting me to this very important discussion. And it's a pleasure to be also with other esteemed colleagues on this panel. Well, first of all, maybe it's important to put back in context where Syria is now, because we haven't spoken in details of Syria for a while, and this is partly understandable with the continuous, genocidal war in the Gaza Strip, the extension of the war in Lebanon. Also, another case where I think, and I come back to this later, I think we should have a regional perspective regarding reconstruction more and more, and not only based on a singular country, despite various dynamics. So, first of all, yes, Syria's regime is still ruling large sectors of Syria, 70%, but northern areas are outside of its control, where we were talking about oil resources. In the northeast, most of the oil resources of Syria are. But even prior to 2011, Syria was not anymore self-sufficient in terms of energetic resources, notably oil. So the northeast is under the control of the autonomous administration area, and the northwest is divided between Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, a Salafist jihadist group, and Turkish domination areas. Regarding the normalization process, we must say that it remains very much limited to diplomatic processes rather than political and economic deep exchanges. Despite the return of Syria to the League of Arab States, normalization process with Saudi Arabia, prior to this with the UAE and other regional countries, political and economic exchange have remained very much limited. Indeed, even in the case of Turkey, there's been to some extent also a normalization process, but here also we see it mostly limited, restricted to security agreements. One of the main reasons for this is that Syria cannot deliver, is unwilling or unable to deliver, notably on different wildcards, as you mentioned, the Captagon issue or the refugee issue, despite claims by the Syrian regime that it is willing to welcome Syrian refugees back to Syria. This is obviously only propaganda, whether politically, economically, or in security dynamics. It is unwilling to welcome a large number of population back to Syria. And if we look at the case of because of the consequences of the war in Lebanon, around 300,000 to 500,000 Syrian citizens came back to Syria, but it's most probably temporary. Especially if we look at the demographic of the people that came, mostly people of under 18 years old, otherwise elderly people, women, while most of the men most probably stayed in Lebanon to work because they sent back money despite the war situation, etc. So we can see that the normalization is, first of all, very much limited, and it will remain limited as much as the war continues as well in Gaza, and Syria is not a top priority in this perspective for the regional countries or more widely the international countries. So this brings us to your question: what about the reconstruction? Is it a priority of the Syrian regime? It is definitely not a priority if we understand reconstruction as reconstructing damaged areas, destroyed neighborhoods, destroyed cities, especially we look at cases such as Eastern Aleppo, which came back under the control of the regime since the end of 2016, or other areas such as rural Damascus with different cases, but the territories of rural Damascus that returned under the control of the Syrian regime in 2018. Still are very much destroyed for a large part of them. Again, there are differences according to neighborhoods, cities, depending on the potential networks the regime have in these areas. But more generally, if we look at the reconstruction process in Syria, is very much limited. And it has been based on the necessity to consolidate the regime's power and its networks. If we look at the policies of the Syrian government or the Syrian regime or the laws they've been implementing regarding housing, land, expropriation, they all have the same dynamics, benefiting private business networks aligned or close connected to the presidential palace, therefore the center of power in Damascus, directly the Assad family, but moreover dynamics of depossession, of dispossession of the civilians, and also of new capital accumulation. Therefore, when we see so-called construction process phase, we look at, and this was a dynamic that started prior to 2011 and that is widely present in different areas of the Middle East and North Africa, is construction project focusing on luxurious real estate project like the famous Marota city, or areas that would benefit capital accumulation. For example, reconstructing the old zoo of Aleppo, which was partly funded by the Syria Trust Development and other foreign funding, or the zoo of Homs, which is part of, if you want, encouraging forms of capital accumulation in trade, tourism, etc. So it's not a reconstruction that is targeting the wider population. And we shouldn't forget that Syria, more than 16 million people need humanitarian assistance. Level of poverty have exploded in the last decade. Over 80%, 90% of the population live under the poverty line. So definitely there are, I would say, huge challenges and objective obstacles, like the lack of also human capital. Migration is still very much important. Essential products are lacking, issue of transport networks. If you compare the level of destruction, the volume, and what would be expected for the reconstruction process, we're talking about $250 billion, $400 billion, and the current budget for the next year in Syria is $4 billion USD. But there are more structural problems in the way the reconstruction process is being built. Because I think we have to understand reconstruction process not only about reconstructing damaged or destroyed areas, but as a wider process of political economy, putting the basis for an economic recovery. And this is the key problem. Actually, the Syrian regime policies are built into inequality, reproducing inequalities, reproducing and even deepening, I would say, the problems that were at the source of the uprising in 2011, which is inequality, lack of productive development, etc. And moreover, there are structural problems in the way that in the budget's investment of the same government, investment for infrastructures are very low. We're not talking about big amount. Why? Since 2016, the government's policy has been to say and to encourage the private sector to play a key role. The private sector is very small. Assets in private banks in Syria don't exceed 3 to 4 billion. And when it comes to foreign actors, allies of Syria have limitation. Russia and Iran both have economic problems, facing sanctions, wars, while the private sector is not interested into, if you want, building public housing for the large majority of the Syrian, but luxurious real estate, etc. So we both have objective challenges and obstacles, as I mentioned, but they are more structural problems when it comes to the reconstruction process. So to come back to resume my answer, no, the Assad regime is not interested in a reconstruction process providing key housing, key infrastructures, equality for the large majority of the Syrian population, but is seeking through a reconstruction process to consolidate its regime, accumulate new forms of capital accumulation, new forms of dispossession of the Syrian population, and achieve its security and favor its business networks.
Thank you, Joseph. Extremely interesting point, actually, on the political economy of survival and the need to understand the reconstruction or lack of among this bigger frame that you described. Actually, on this related to the political economy, the larger political economy picture, definitely. Let me move to discussing maybe the prerequisites of successful reconstruction or functional reconstruction, let's say. I'd like really to start with Noor here. I mean, in terms of, I mean, if we speak about Gaza, there are certainly some important lessons learned from the previous wars, because at least the last episode of the 2014 war was followed by a reconstruction process. So, what are the lessons learned from your perspective, Noor? On reconstruction, if we look at specifically to this the post 2014 conflict, and on one side, and what would be the prerequisites of reconstruction for Gaza in the future?
Thank you, Hamza. So given the challenges that I mentioned in my first answer to your question, we know that the reconstruction process will be a very complex and non-linear process. But if we were to look at the previous cycles of reconstruction, and there are some key pillars that we can identify to guide future reconstruction. And the first one has to do with how we approach reconstruction, and this is very much linked to Joseph in his last answer. So in the Gaza context, the prevailing approach to reconstruction has largely been one-dimensional, focused on physical rebuilding, like rebuilding infrastructure, schools, health clinics, water pipes, houses, etc., like focusing on physical infrastructure, but not while ignoring other equally important dimensions, which are basically the political, the economic, and the social dimension. So one major lesson, Hamza, is the importance to revisit the predominant approach to reconstruction and redefine it as a multi-dimensional process that has a physical, political, economic, and social aspect to it. And here, the political dimension is of prime importance, because past reconstruction efforts in Gaza have made it clear that reconstruction cannot be reduced to a technical or humanitarian process. If we don't address the root causes of the problem, sustainable reconstruction and development will remain unattainable. And that's why the key message here is that any reconstruction plan be tied to a larger political process that to end Israel's blockade on the Gaza Strip and Israel's larger occupation industry, while recognizing Palestinian rights to self-determination, freedom, and justice. In the absence of a political framework, reconstruction would actually just be like band-aids, or like it would provide temporary fixes, but it would be very unlikely to secure donor support due to what I mentioned before, the prevailing sense of futility, as many donors have become reluctant to fund reconstruction given the repeated cycle of war and destruction. And here in this regard, European countries actually can play a very important role because they have a legal responsibility to put pressure on Israel to end its occupation of Palestinian land, which has been declared unlawful by the International Court of Justice in July this year. And in the Palestinian context, and I'm still focusing here on the political dimension of reconstruction, reconstruction should also be linked to achieving reconciliation, reunifying the Palestinian people, reconnecting Gaza with the rest of the occupied Palestinian territory, and also rebuilding a new leadership model, an inclusive, accountable political system that would represent Palestinians from all walks of life. So that's one dimension, the political dimension, besides physical rebuilding. The third dimension is the economic one, and it's closely interlinked with the political dimension, because you cannot build a viable economy if it remains under siege, if it's isolated from the rest of the occupied Palestinian territory or from the rest of the world. And you can never have a viable economy if Palestinians lack sovereignty over their borders and natural resources. The fourth dimension is the societal one, of course. Although sometimes it gets overlooked. Here, like a comprehensive strategy for the future would have to address the mental health crisis, the trauma that's affecting all Gazans, and concrete important steps have to be taken specifically by Palestinians here to counter the increasing atomization of the Palestinian society, both within Gaza and also between Gaza and the rest of Palestine. So that's one lesson, Hamza, that has to do with how we define or approach reconstruction. Another lesson specifically from the 2014 war, which you mentioned, because after the 2014 war, there's a mechanism that has been established by the United Nations in cooperation with the Palestinian Authority and Israel, and it's the Gaza Reconstruction Mechanism. And one of the key problematic aspects of the Gaza Reconstruction Mechanism, besides the fact that it basically was another tool of domination used by Israel to control how reconstruction would take place, another key problematic aspect of it was that it completely sidelined Palestinians from Gaza in the reconstruction process. So in the future, any reconstruction process, in my opinion, will have to be bottom-up, internally driven, and it has to ensure local ownership and agency, to ensure the alignment of reconstruction efforts with the needs of the population. And this is very important to uphold Gazans' rights to self-determination, but also to basically take advantage of the indigenous knowledge and the experience that Gazans have accumulated over the past, from the 5 previous rounds of reconstruction. So Gaza-based representatives must be at the center of the institutional architecture for any future reconstruction process. A third pillar, and these pillars are not exhaustive by any means, I think would be to integrate macro level strategies with a micro level approach. I found Joseph's note about the need for a regional perspective on reconstruction to be very, very interesting. So I hope we get to discuss this in the Q&A if we have the time. But here, my focus is actually simply on the Gaza Strip. And the main point is that while large-scale infrastructure projects are essential, a granular perspective that would focus on taking advantage of local niches in each community in Gaza could also be helpful to ensure that the interventions are tailored and address the distinct socioeconomic fabric of each area. And the fourth pillar, and I will end here for the sake of limited time we have, is that given the extreme food insecurity in Gaza, it would be very urgent to rebuild the food system and promote food production for local consumption. People people should be given the tools necessary to produce food that would meet their own needs, to avoid increasing reliance on donor aid. And here, small-scale agriculture has to be revalued. Sustainable agricultural practices must be promoted as part of a larger strategy to build a productive base for the economy, and also address the environmental disaster that has been one of the main impacts of Israel's ongoing war on the Strip. But needless to say, this will be extremely, extremely challenging with the destruction of agricultural land that has been taking place for the past 13 months. I'll stop here, Hamza.
Thank you, Noor. I'd like to remain in the Mashriq in a way, and speaking about geopolitics, because one of the key aspects that has been actually discussed a lot by analysts, etc., is the need maybe in order for any reconstruction process or efforts to take place for a regional settlement. So no one will pay actually without really having a sort of regional settlement. And the issue of a regional settlement is quite really uncertain today. It seems to me, and here I would like really to bring Joseph to the discussion, because the geopolitics is and has always been extremely important for the Syrian regime. It seems like the war in Gaza has been a really game changer in the geopolitics of the region, but also the calculation of the Assad regime. It seems that the regime has got actually caught today into big geopolitical game between Iran and Russia on one side, Israel and the US on the other side, and the situation in Lebanon with Hezbollah weakened, but also the war expanded to Lebanon, etc. So my question is here regarding these the prerequisites of reconstruction. Do you think that a geopolitical maybe settlement would be inevitable in order to start a sort of reconstruction, specifically in the case of Syria? Because what we have actually, many analysts, have been repeating that it seems like there won't be reconstruction without transition. So or the Assad regime will be always, successful in securing its survival. So my question is, to what extent this geopolitical really turmoil is offering opportunities to the regime to maneuver, or squeezing more the regime and really putting it in the brink of probably collapse, of a regime change. And this actually will bring the issue of transition, regime change in Damascus as, within a bigger picture of a new geopolitical order, or the emergence of a new geopolitical order. So I'd like really, Joseph, to have your thoughts on the issue of how the Assad regime is navigating this geopolitics, the current geopolitical turmoil today in the region, and connecting this with the idea of transition and reconstruction.
Thank you, Hamza. Again, a very important question, and I think we have to be still a bit humble, because unfortunately the war is not finished. Whether against the Palestinian population in the Gaza Strip or Lebanon, and therefore there are many things that can still occur and happen, and I think we are unfortunately again in this war for more than a few weeks, but months most probably. This is the first thing to say. So the events are ongoing. But what can we already say since more than a year now, following the beginning of the genocide war against the Gaza Strip and the extension to the war in Lebanon, is, first of all, when we look at Syria's positioning since then, it made quite clear since the beginning and afterwards of the 7th of October that they did not want to participate in any way in any kind of direct conflict with Israel. Some people, some analysts argued that, and rightly so, it's because of the weakened position of the Assad regime, because also foreign state advised the Syrian regime not to participate in this war. We had, news that the UAE did advise the Syrian regime. I think the Syrian regime had no intentions from the beginning to participate directly in any kind of confrontation against Israel. And this is not due only to its weakening, but historically speaking, if we look at the behavior of the Syrian regime regarding Israel since 74 and until 2011, the Syrian regime has always been very careful to have no kind of violent confrontation with Israel on Syrian territories. This is even why it prevented, since 74, any form of armed resistance or resistance from Syrian territories towards the occupied Golan. The only times there were kind of direct confrontation between the Syrian army in Israel was in Lebanon during the Lebanese civil war, and mostly indirectly. Syria's territory has played a role when it came to the transfer of weapons, armament to Hezbollah, especially and growingly since the 80s, 90s, and it took even a more strategic path following the arrival of Bashar Assad in a rapprochement, let's say, between the Syrian regime and Hezbollah that was particularly viewed in 2006. And in the aftermath of it, Syrian regime, if you remember, politically benefited from this war to progressively, play an intermediary role with Iran, but also start new kind of relation with France, with the US, etc., because of its political role. After 2011, this changed, and Hezbollah's influence and Iranian influence in Syria has grown extensively. But what is clear is that for a year, and if you remember, the Israeli bombing of Syria has not started since the 7th of October. It's been ongoing for the past nearly, I would say, 8 to 9 years, specifically targeting pro-Iranian or pro-Hezbollah targets. But in the past few weeks, it has targeted not only, I would say, this kind of actors, but more and more also Syrian military installation. This was the case before, but also in more urban cities, I would say. Damascus, also key individuals connected to Hezbollah financial networks. But what is clear is that Israel is not accepting even the passive role that the Syrian regime is playing today, letting Hezbollah, transfer its weapons from Syria to Iran, to Syria to Lebanon. Even the passive role of the Syrian regime is not accepted. And if auditors remember, a few days before the Pagers attack, there was an attack by the Israeli occupation army against a military installation within Syria, with commandos for the first time, putting their feet in Syria, that targeted most probably a military installation that was producing drones or weapons for Hezbollah. So it's clear that they are threatening the Syrian regime by saying, we don't even accept your passive role, try to prevent as much as possible transfer of men, weapons, etc. Now, to say that they want regime change, I don't believe this. No one has a particular interest. Rather, on the opposite, Israel has constantly, since 2011, said that they would be happy with the Assad staying in power, but they're afraid of Iranian Hezbollah influence at their borders. Similarly, when we look at Western actors, except France at a particular moment, the US were never really in favor of dramatic regime change. They were preferring, a change from within the regime. What happened in Egypt, for example, but they were not keen on regime change. And Today, this is even more the case. So this comes from the second geopolitical dynamics. We spoke about the region regarding Israel not even accepting in the past few weeks the passive role, I would say, the Syrian regime is playing for its own sake. And it's also for the Syrian regime to send a message to the Western audience and Gulf monarchy saying, listen, we didn't participate in this war. We're not interested to play a role, rather neutral. But this is even not accepted, as I was saying, by Israel. I think there's a second also dynamic that has to be taken to consideration is the constant rise of the far right in Europe and the focus on migration. And this is why more and more countries are not at all seeking any kind of regime change, and this hasn't been the case for quite a while, are ready to stop, the traditional policy of the three no's: no normalization, no lifting of sanctions, no reconstruction. I'm not saying it's going to be a dramatic change, but I think there's going to be more flexibility regarding these subjects. And there's because the if you want, what in Europe we call the refugee crisis, which I think it's not a right terminology, because the number of refugees is much more important in neighboring countries like Turkey, Lebanon, and Jordan than in Europe. Europe fear of new arrival of migrants and the rise of the far right, continuous rise of the far right, could push a certain number of actors to seek, if you want, more flexible relations with the same regime. And unfortunately, the issue, if you, or the indicator that democratic rights or respect of human rights should be at the top of priorities, we must be very clear, never have been at the top of the list for European countries or the US. I think the case of Palestine is quite, telling in this perspective. So this means you won't have a dramatic change like tomorrow reconstruction is going to occur and Syria, but more flexibility. And also we can see how geopolitics have, influenced humanitarian political aid that has consistently diminished, especially after the Russian invasion of Ukraine, where the priorities of European countries turned towards Ukraine rather than Syria. Now you have Lebanon, Palestine, Gaza Strip more specifically. So you will see a diminution. And therefore, again, I think this will push certain countries to have more flexibility towards Damascus with the rise of the far right. So this puts, again, I think to conclude on this point, because I'm being a bit long, that you won't see a reconstruction process accelerating in 1 year, but you will have more flexibility. And one of the indicators also of this is that there's more attempts, which I don't think is negative, but to put more funds into early recovery in the humanitarian funds in the perspective of rebuilding, or at least assisting in the reconstruction of infrastructures that are keys for development. But again, I think these changes will take time. And finally, also Syria is not a direct priority for the US. This is also important to take into consideration, I think.
Thank you, Joseph. Let me conclude with Jalal. Jalal, I think Libya is challenging many paradigms, actually. One of the key assumptions made by many analysts, etc., and Libya watchers, that the economy will bring a sort of, appeasement to the country, will maybe facilitate a peace process, settlement, etc. Once the Libyan actors will agree on the production and management of oil, things will start maybe, to chances to get to a settlement will increase. But again, we are seeing now that probably there is an agreement for sure, as you mentioned, on the division or the redistribution of of oil in a way. But at the same time, it seems like this is making an entrenched Libya actually, or making the conflict in Libya, the fragmentation, the security and political fragmentation of the country more entrenched. So my question is, to what extent actually the reconstruction today will remain disconnected from rebuilding or reconstituting a central authority in the country? It seems like, a reconstruction will keep and will preserve the division within the country. and probably even foster maybe future division within the blocks between the East and the West. Happy really to have your thoughts on this.
Yeah, of course. Thank you, Hamza. Well, first of all, when we talked about the politicization of Reconstruction, so when it's very politicized, you don't realize, but there's only one particular category of reconstruction that you will pursue. Like if you need to build a new stadium or new building that people can see, it will buy you more mileage points in terms of popularity than if you do some boring but vital piece of maintenance to an existing infrastructure, let's say the man-made river network in Libya, which is vital, and everybody has been taking it for granted, and a lot of the maintenance has been missing. So politicized reconstruction doesn't mean sustainable form of outcome. There's all kinds of distortions. And in terms of agreeing on the economy, I mean, the main thing that rival factions have agreed upon over the last couple of years is on theft. So this is problematic because, first of all, it doesn't go to the population. It's actually the money we're talking about that rival factions agree on is being stolen from the Libyan population. And the other thing that the notion of theft introduces is that everything is dynamic. So the agreement, first of all, works only when the oil prices are high. So a lot of banks are seeing a drop in the barrel price of the next year, for instance. Everybody got used to 75. Maybe those agreements in Libya will collapse if Brent goes to 50. So that's number one. And the other thing is that the agreement is very short-lived. You agree on principle, but it's not an exact science. And then 6 months later, you become angry because you realize that the rival that you kind of agreed with has been making out much better than you. So you feel that it wasn't really part of the plan, and the amount of money that is being stolen by the enemy is a little bit too much. So you try to correct that, you start improvising, and then everything kind of collapses. So don't forget, before Sudan, before April 2023, Burhan and Hamati were supposed to agree on theft, and we know the result. So it's a very poor quality of peace that it buys you. And the other thing that I want to say also is I would like to echo what Noor was saying about Gaza. And it might sound absurd to compare Derna with Gaza, but it's not absurd. It's 12,000 people who died in a couple hours in a city of 100,000. So the intensity of the shock, for example, the trauma on children, is comparable to Gaza. And for example, she very correctly mentioned the lack of mental health support as part of the recovery efforts. And needless to say, the authorities in Eastern Libya have been completely neglecting this aspect of particularly the children. So here again, because it's boring, it doesn't buy you any kind of popularity, or especially not on a nationwide basis. Nobody sees it. You spend money. You have to maintain it. It's unspectacular. So you have all these distortions that become entrenched. So what I would say is that I'm very pessimistic. So whatever has been done, I recognize. And again, I cannot vouch for the quality of whatever has come out of the ground, but it's better than nothing. What has been done by particularly the Haftar family in the east, in Derna and other cities, and but they have been doing this as part of a 3 or 4 year campaign. They are very ambitious. They believe that the momentum will be preserved. I don't see that happening. I see a very major economic crisis affecting all of Libya next year. And a lot of the dynamics that have been prevailing for the last 12 months will turn out to be completely obsolete because they assume so many things. It assumes that as I said, the rival faction is not as smart as you are. But of course, once you have proven a new scheme, the other side wakes up to it. And I think a lot of the central bank crisis that I was mentioning earlier was triggered by in Tripoli. And we might see other crises like this. And this in a context where a lot of the schemes turn out to be unsustainable because too much money has been stolen so fast. I think it's personally, I'm very, very cautious and pessimistic.
Yeah. Thank you, Jalal. Fortunately, we are really running out of time. I'd like really to thank you, to thank the three speakers. I mean, it was a rich and very interesting discussion. We covered many aspects of the political economy of reconstruction, challenges, prerequisites, geopolitics behind the reconstruction. I mean, I think there is really space to keep this discussion going and to organize more really panel discussions on this topic for sure, given the importance and given the context also in the region. Thank you so much. Thanks to Noor, to Joseph, and Jalal. Thanks to the audience. I'm really sorry I couldn't really ask some questions that were sent by the audience, but for sure we will be organizing other webinars. So keep following us on our Carnegie YouTube channel. Have a nice day or rest of the day, and stay tuned for future webinars with Carnegie Middle East Center. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Hamza, thank you.